In 1954, high in the French Alps, an entire village disappeared overnight. Not a single person remained. The doors to the houses stood unlocked. Meals sat half-finished on wooden tables. Candles still burned in windows that looked out over empty streets. The animals, cows, goats, even the shepherd dogs, were left behind, tethered and restless. But every man, woman, and child was gone. 300 souls vanished in a single night. Not to those who came searching in the following days. It looked as if life itself had been interrupted mid-breath. A loaf of bread still warm on the windowsill. A teacup still steaming beside a chair. Toys scattered on the steps of the schoolhouse. As if the people had simply stood up and walked into the mist and never returned. Asterisk newspapers at the time struggled for words. They called it a ghost village, an alpine tragedy, a mystery of silence. Officials dismissed it as hysteria, suggesting evacuation, migration, or even mass delusion. But the villagers' belongings told a different story. Everything of value, money, jewelry, personal keepsakes remained untouched. They had not run away. They had not packed. They had not prepared. They had simply left. For nearly 70 years, the lake that swallowed the valley kept its secret. When the government constructed a hydroelectric dam downstream in the late 1950s, the rising waters covered what was left of the village. And so, for decades, the place where 300 people had once lived and vanished lay preserved beneath the surface, hidden, forgotten, until now. Because, in the summer of 2024, a record drought drained the reservoir to its lowest level in history. What emerged from the water stunned even seasoned investigators. The church steeple, blackened with moss, piercing the surface like a warning finger. The skeletal remains of rooftops. Narrow cobblestone streets revealed in patterns of mud. The village had returned from the depths. But what it brought back with it was not peace. Pause, low tone. They called it St. Marin, a name lost on most maps. A place the world had chosen to forget, but the lake remembers. The lake remembers everything. When divers from the local preservation society descended into the shallow basin, they expected ruins. They expected collapsed beams, decayed furniture, remnants of another era. What they found instead was something impossible. Beneath the cracked floor of the church, hidden under sediment and time, lay a carved stone tablet, and on it 17 names. Names that did not match the registry of the vanished villagers. Names no historian, no genealogist, no record could account for. Names that belonged to no one. As if the village had buried not only its dead, but strangers. Strangers never meant to be remembered. One diver described the feeling in his report. The air was wrong. The silence was heavier down there, even underwater, as if something watched from the stones. From that moment forward, St. Marin was no longer just a lost village. It was a crime scene. And for the first time in 70 years, investigators reopened the case of the village that vanished overnight. On the evening of May 12, 1954, St. Marin prepared for a celebration. Records show a wedding was planned for that weekend, the marriage of a local farmer's daughter to a miller's son. Preparations filled the streets. Musicians rehearsed. Food was being prepared in communal kitchens. For many, it was the last ordinary night they would ever know. By sunrise, the village was empty. The postman, arriving from the neighboring town, was the first to notice. He entered the square expecting music, chatter, livestock moving in the fields. Instead, there was silence. The houses looked inhabited, smoke still curling from chimneys. But no one answered his calls. As he walked the streets, unease grew. Inside the church, pews were in order, hymnals open on their stands. but no priest, no parishioners. Just the echo of his own footsteps. At the inn, a table was set for breakfast. Eggs fried, bread sliced, coffee half poured. But the guests and the hosts were gone by noon. Alarm spread to neighboring villages. Search parties combed the forest trails, the mountain passes, the riverside. They expected to find at least some sign of struggle tracks in the dirt, overturned. Wagons, bodies, but they found nothing. Not a single footprint leading out. Not a drop of blood. Not even signs of panic. St. Marin had simply emptied itself like water draining from a glass. When the gendarmes arrived, they sealed the perimeter. They documented the homes, the possessions, the livestock. They found jewelry boxes still full, coins left on tables. Rifles hung neatly on walls. The people had not fled from bandits. They had not been taken by force. They had not prepared to leave. And yet, they were gone. Asterisk, asterisk rumors spread faster than facts. Some spoke of a plague, though no bodies were found. Others whispered of a landslide or avalanche, though the mountains showed no scars. Old farmers muttered of les voix de l'eau, the voices of the water. Tales of something ancient that alive beneath the lakebed long before the dam. Stories dismissed by officials, but kept alive in the hush of taverns for decades to come. The government concluded its investigation within 5 years. The official record was stamped with 3 words: mass migration presumed. The file was sealed. The dam was completed. And St. Marin sank beneath the waters. History moved on. But memory stayed waiting in the dark, beat until the summer of 2024, when the lake gave St. Marin back. What happened on that night in 1954? Who carved the names hidden beneath the church? And why, after 70 years, did the lake choose to reveal them now? As the investigation deepens, each answer uncovers another, darker question. And the village that vanished overnight may not have vanished at all. To understand the vanishing of St. Marin, we must first understand the village itself. Nestled in a valley between towering alpine peaks, St. Marin was not a large place. Barely 300 people called it home. Families who had lived there for generations. Farmers who tended goats and sheep on the hillsides. A miller whose wheel turned day and night with the glacial river that carved the valley. A priest who kept the little stone church alive with the sound of bells. It was an ordinary village, quiet, simple, unremarkable. Until the night it became a legend. The records that remain municipal logs, census lists, letters sent to relatives in nearby towns paint a picture of a self-sufficient community. Children played in the dirt streets. Women gathered at the communal ovens. Men repaired roofs and tended crops. The war, less than a decade behind them, had scarred the region, but life in St. Marin was slow to change. Some said it was a place where time itself seemed to hesitate, lingering in old customs long forgotten by the cities below. Neighbors described the people of St. Marin as devout, sometimes too devout. The church stood at the very center of the village, its spire visible from every direction. Festivals were marked with processions and rituals, some inherited from Catholic tradition, others older, stranger customs said to predate the faith that now wrapped them. At midsummer, the villagers lit great fires beside the river and sang songs no outsider recognized. At harvest, they carved symbols into bread loaves before breaking them apart. To them, these were harmless traditions, remnants of ancestors. To outsiders, they felt different, ancient, a little unsettling. Still, St. Marin was a peaceful place. Until the night of May 12, 1954. That evening, the village was alive with preparation. In 2 days' time, a wedding was to take place, the daughter of a farmer, the son of a miller. By all accounts, the village had been buzzing with anticipation. Girls embroidered ribbons. Boys practiced music on fiddles and drums. Women filled pots with stew. Men hammered tables together for the feast. It was meant to be a night of joy, a celebration of continuity after years of hardship. But joy was not what the morning revealed. At sunrise, when the postman arrived, he found silence. His testimony remains in the record. I entered the square, and all was still. The ovens smoked, the animals bleated, but no one came to greet me. It was as if the entire village had drawn breath and forgotten to release it. The first house he entered belonged to the bride's family. Bread sat cooling on the windowsill. A pot of stew simmered low on the fire. Upstairs, dresses were laid out for the ceremony. But the rooms were empty. In the next house, he found the same and unfinished meal. Beds unmade, chairs pulled back as if someone had stood suddenly. By the third house, panic crept in. He ran to the church, but there too, silence. Hymnals open, candles burning, no priest, no congregation. Just the echo of his own steps. Within hours, word spread to the next villages. Farmers abandoned their fields to rush up the valley. They searched homes, barns, stables. They combed the riverbanks, the forest paths, the mountain ridges. But nowhere did they find footprints leading away, or signs of flight. It was as if 300 souls had walked into the mist and dissolved. The gendarmes arrived by nightfall. They sealed the perimeter. Their reports, now yellowed with age, remained chilling in their matter-of-fact detail. Personal items of value left in plain sight. Jewelry on knit-stands, coins on tables, livestock untended. No sign of struggle. In one home, a clock had stopped at 2:17 a.m. In another, a phonograph played endlessly, the needle scratching at the end of a record until it wore a groove. In the schoolhouse, the blackboard bore a single phrase in chalk: "I'll Saint Venus." They came. No one knows who wrote it. No handwriting sample could be matched. But those 3 words remain the only message left behind by the vanished villagers of St. Marin. The search expanded. Police dogs were brought in. They wandered the streets, but gave no bark, no lead. Air reconnaissance revealed nothing unusual. The forests and peaks remained untouched, the rivers calm. With no signs of violence, no bodies, and no survivors, officials reached for explanations. Some suggested mass poisoning, but the wells and food showed no contaminants. Others whispered of cult activity, but no artifacts were found beyond the villagers' own traditions. In the absence of evidence, silence grew. Silence and speculation. Locals in nearby towns spoke of strange lights over the valley that night, blue and white, dancing above the trees, fading at dawn. Others claimed to hear a long, low sound, like a horn or a bell carried by the wind. Old men told tales of les voix de l'eau, the voices of the water, stories of something that called from beneath the lakebed, long before the dam was built. Stories outsiders dismissed as superstition, but the people of the valley did not forget. They whispered it in taverns and fields, in their prayers. The water remembers. By 1959, the government declared the case closed. With the hydroelectric dam completed, the waters of the new reservoir rose. St. Marin sank beneath the lake, its mystery drowned along with its streets. The official record gave a sterile conclusion. Mass migration presumed, evidence inconclusive. But migration leaves traces: carts, wagons, letters to relatives. St. Marin left nothing, not even goodbye notes. Only vanished rooms, unfinished meals, and a silence that deepened with water and time. For decades, St. Marin lay hidden. Fishermen cast nets above its rooftops. Children swam where once a square had stood. The world forgot. But lakes do not forget. Lakes remember. And in 2024, when drought pulled the waters back, the past rose again. Streets emerged in patterns of mud. The church spire broke the surface. And beneath it all, waiting like a wound, lay the truth no one wanted to see. The story of St. Marin was not over. It had only been waiting for someone brave or foolish enough to listen. The return of St. Marin in 2024 did not just bring ruins, it brought questions. And questions, as investigators soon discovered, have a way of multiplying. When the lake receded, researchers combed through the exposed mud streets, searching for artifacts. They found remnants of daily life, rusted cooking pots, broken shoes, fragments of toys. Each piece a reminder that real families had once lived here. But among the ordinary, there were things that did not belong. Things that shifted the mystery from tragedy to something darker. ****. The first was discovered inside the church. Divers had already found the carved stone tablet beneath its foundation, bearing 17 names unlinked to any record. But as the mud was cleared from the nave, another detail emerged. On the far wall, scratched deep into plaster, were markings, rows of lines, counted in fives, like tallies. There were hundreds of them, some neat, others frantic, as if someone, or many someones, had been counting days. Counting time, but time toward what? Even stranger, beneath the tallies, a single phrase in Latin, non transirunt. They did not pass out in the schoolhouse, preserved in silt and algae. Investigators uncovered the blackboard, still bearing its final message. Isles sont Venus. They came. The chalk, surprisingly intact after 7 decades underwater, was protected by layers of mineral deposit. But something else stood out. On the windowsill, etched with a knife, were 3 letters, A.V. No one knows who carved them. Some argued it stood for Ave Maria, a plea for protection. Others wondered if it was a name, a person, or something older. These discoveries unsettled, even hardened investigators. They were not remnants of daily life, frozen in time. They were messages, pleas, warnings, as if the villagers had known something was coming and had tried, desperately, to leave behind a record. But if that were true, why did no one escape? Why were there no survivors, save the one old woman, who came forward decades later, her memory clouded by fear? Among the ruins, archaeologists found household items curiously placed. A row of children's shoes lined neatly at the entrance of one home. A rosary buried intentionally beneath floorboards. In the bakery, loaves of bread with strange symbols carved into the crust, triangles, spirals, and crosses overlaid. Were these symbols blessings or warnings? Old residents from neighboring villages remembered them. One woman, now in her 90s, told reporters, "We always thought St. Marin was different. They sang songs we didn't know. Their bread had marks we never used. At midsummer, they burned fires and said it was for the harvest. But I saw things in those flame shapes, shadows. They weren't like us." The deeper the investigation went, the less St. Marin looked like a simple case of disappearance. It looked like something orchestrated, something hidden. And then came the most disturbing discovery of all. Beneath the village tavern, divers uncovered a sealed cellar. The door, reinforced with iron, had been barred from the inside. When they forced it open, they found the air thick with decay, though no bodies lay within. Instead, they found objects arranged with unsettling precision. 7 chairs, all facing a single wall. On that wall, carved deep, was a circle enclosing a symbol across with hooks at each end, radiating outward. Beneath it, in French, Isles nous gardent. They are keeping us. Forensics dated the carvings to the 1950s. The chairs, wooden and crude, showed signs of wear as if used repeatedly. Some described it as a meeting place, others as a prison. But either way, it suggested something the official records had long denied, that the villagers had not simply vanished. They had been held, kept, and perhaps, willingly or unwillingly, gathered for something no one outside ever saw. Folklorists were quick to connect these clues with older legends of the region. The valley, they said, had long been associated with stories of sacrifice, tales of the lake spirits that demanded offerings, songs sung in dialects no longer spoken. A 19th-century priest once wrote in his diary that the people of St. Marin danced too closely with the waters. He warned his superiors that pagan rites persisted in the valley. His letter went unanswered, and 2 years later he was transferred without explanation. Coincidence? Perhaps, but when combined with the tally marks, the symbols in bread, the warnings carved into wood and stone, the image becomes more sinister. St. Maring was not simply forgotten. St. Maring was erased. And maybe, just maybe, it erased itself. In 1961, 7 years after the disappearance, a shepherd claimed to have found a journal on the ridge above the reservoir. He brought it to the authorities, but it was dismissed as a forgery. The journal, which surfaced decades later in a private collection, contains fragmented entries. They say the water will rise. The priest says it is not the dam. They told us to gather at midnight. I heard the bells, but they did not ring from the tower. Whether the journal is authentic remains debated, but its words echo the fear found in the carvings and symbols. Fear of something unseen. Fear that the villagers believed their end was coming, not by nature, not by accident, but by design. The first clues recovered from the mud of St. Marin pointed not to mass migration, nor to natural disaster. They pointed to ritual, to preparation, to a collective act of disappearance. And yet, the villagers' belongings tell another story: meals abandoned, lives interrupted, daily routines left incomplete. If they had prepared for something, why had they left so suddenly? And why leave behind every object of value? Modern. Investigators split into two camps. One group believes the villagers were victims of an organized cult or sect, forced into rituals they could not escape. The other suggests complicity, that the villagers themselves participated willingly, convinced by leaders or voices only they heard. But both theories circle back to the same chilling truth. Whatever happened in St. Marin, it was not random. It was chosen. The first clues, the tallies in the church, the chalk on the schoolhouse, the sealed cellar beneath the tavern paint, a picture not of a village struck by sudden disaster, but of a community consumed by something deeper, something older, something they believed was watching from the waters. And if that is true, then the question is not just why St. Marin vanished, but what called them into the lake in the first place. The lake remembers. And the deeper we look, the darker its memory becomes. Asterisk, asterisk, by the end of that summer in 2024, a drought had lowered the lake to levels unseen in nearly a century. What had once been a vast mirror of water shrank into a shallow basin, revealing the bones of St. Marin. For archaeologists, it was an opportunity of a lifetime. For the locals, it was a haunting. And for the divers sent into the deepest parts of the ruins, it was something else entirely. A descent into a nightmare that blurred the line between discovery and warning. The team's initial dives focused on the church, its stone walls still standing beneath layers of algae and silt. It was here, beneath the altar, that they uncovered something that would shift the narrative forever. A trapdoor, sealed with rusted iron bands, had gone unnoticed for 70 years. When pried open, it revealed a narrow staircase leading into blackness. Divers descended carefully, lights cutting through the murk. What they found was not a crypt, as expected. It was a chamber. And the chamber was not empty. Lined along its walls were niches, carved with precision, each containing small wooden figures, dozens of them. The figures were crude, but unmistakably human, their faces scratched with wide, hollow eyes. Every single one bore a mark carved into its chest, a spiral cut deep, stained darker than the surrounding wood. In the center of the chamber sat a table of stone. Upon it rested a book, its leather cover bloated from water, but intact. A journal, a record, a voice from the past. The journal, carefully preserved after its recovery, contained entries written in the months leading up to May of 1954. The hand belonged to the village priest, Father André. His words were brief, often fragmented, but the fear in them was unmistakable. March 2nd. The waters are restless again. The elders sing the old songs at night. March 18th. They bring offerings to the river. I begged them to stop. They do not listen. April 9th. The children speak of voices. I hear them too, low, calling. May 11th. They say it must be done, that the village will be spared if we obey. I cannot. I must. The final entry trailed off mid-sentence, the ink blurred by water. But one word remained legible, underlined twice. Isles. Them, the discovery of Father André's journal, was a turning point. For the first time, there was evidence that the disappearance had not been a sudden act of fate or violence, but something anticipated, something prepared for. The priest himself, torn between faith and fear, had tried to resist, but had been pulled into silence with the rest of his flock. And yet, what exactly ILS referred to, no one could say. Was it men? Spirits? Something else entirely? If the journal was unsettling, the second discovery was chilling. In the ruins of the town hall, divers uncovered a metal box, sealed tight and wedged beneath a desk. Inside, among soggy papers, lay a small reel-to-reel audio tape. Miraculously, portions were still playable after restoration. The voice was faint, warped, but recognizable as that of a young man, likely a clerk or record keeper. His words, recorded in French, stuttered with panic. The bells are not ours. They ring from under the ground. No one sleeps, children gone first, then the men. Then the tape cut into static, then a long piercing sound like metal dragged across stone. Experts later argued it was water pressure or mechanical failure, but others swore it was a voice, low, drawn out, almost calling a name. With these discoveries, the case of St. Mirren shifted once again. Theories of natural disaster faded. In their place rose darker suggestions, mass ritual, collective hysteria, or perhaps, as some whispered, an encounter with something unexplainable, something that had demanded obedience, something the villagers had given themselves to willingly. Or not. But the most disturbing part of the 2024 expedition was not the artifacts. It was what the divers themselves experienced. One of them, speaking anonymously, gave an interview to a local paper. His words sent shivers through even the most skeptical readers. Down there, in the dark, you lose your sense of direction. You only have the beam of your light, the sound of your breath. But in St. Mirren, it was worse. I felt watched. The water wasn't just still, it pressed in, like it was listening. At one point, my light passed over a window frame, and inside, I swear I saw a face. Not a skeleton, not remains. A face, pale, eyes open, staring at me. When I blinked, it was gone, but when I checked my oxygen gauge, it had dropped by a quarter in seconds, as if something else was breathing with me. The diver refused to return to the site. Others on the team dismissed it as stress, nitrogen narcosis, tricks of the mind. But privately, they admitted to hearing things, two muffled sounds, like voices speaking just beyond the range of comprehension. A chorus of whispers, always from below. The 2024 discoveries marked the midpoint of the investigation, both in time and in tone. Theories no longer debated whether something had happened But what? The journal, the audio tape, the cellar carvings, all pointed to a single conclusion. The villagers knew. They knew something was coming. They had prepared for it. And when it arrived, they obeyed. But obeyed what? And why leave no trace, no survivors, no explanation beyond cryptic words and symbols? If St. Maron had been erased by an outside force, who or what held the pen? News of the divers' findings spread quickly. International outlets picked up the story, drawing comparisons to Roanoke, the Mary Celeste, other tales of mass disappearance. But St. Maron was different. It was recent enough to have records, photographs, even living relatives. It was not a myth, it was a crime without a culprit, a tragedy without a cause. And now, with tangible evidence, the world was watching. The French government, long content to keep the file closed, announced a new inquiry. Forensic teams returned to the lake. Anthropologists studied the carvings. Linguists analyzed the journal. Everyone searched for answers. But the deeper they dug, the more the questions multiplied. And then, just as the world's attention reached its peak, something happened that would turn fear into dread. Asterisk, asterisk, during a routine dive, one of the archaeologists failed to surface. His body was recovered hours later, tangled in the ruins of the church. The cause of death was listed as drowning, but his colleagues swore his oxygen levels had been stable. Stranger still, his face mask was cracked from the inside, as if pressure had built not around him, but within him. In his log, written just before the dive, he had scrawled 3 words: Isles chantant encore. They are still singing, and with that, the story of St. Maron shifted again. No longer just a mystery of the past, but perhaps a warning for the present. Because if the lake still sings, then maybe, just maybe, the village was never truly gone dot by the autumn of 2024. The story of St. Maron had gone far beyond a local curiosity. Journalists from across Europe descended on the valley, chasing rumors, chasing answers. And as the waterline sank further, new artifacts came to light, artifacts that connected the village's disappearance not just to itself, but to a pattern. Far older and far more unsettling than anyone had imagined, that it began with the parish records. Boxes of documents, long forgotten in a diocesan archive in Grenoble, were rediscovered by a young historian. Inside, she found correspondence between Father André, the priest whose journal had been recovered from beneath the church, and his superiors in the early 1950s. His letters were desperate, pleading, "The elders persist in the old ways." He wrote in 1952, "They meet by the river and whisper names I do not recognize. They mark the children's bread with symbols of the spiral. I fear they no longer pray to God, but to something beneath the waters. I beg for intervention." There was no reply to the letter. But 2 months later, another arrived from André. This one was shorter, colder. "I have been warned not to speak of it again. They say the church cannot interfere. But I tell you, something is coming." These letters, hidden for 70 years, added weight to the notion that St. Maron had not been the victim of a sudden catastrophe, but of a long, deliberate decline into ritual. The villagers had not merely disappeared, they had been preparing for disappearance. And Father André, caught between duty and terror, had left a paper trail the church quietly buried. Around the same time, an estate sale in Lyon revealed something equally chilling. A photograph labeled simply St. Maron, 1953. It showed a group of villagers standing outside the church, dressed in ordinary clothes. But in the corner of the image, half in shadow, stood a figure unlike the rest. Tall, with features obscured by blur, its arms too long, its face pale. Locals insisted no such person lived in St. Maron. Experts debated whether it was a trick of light, a photographic error. But to those who stared at the image too long, there was something undeniable in the figure's presence. It was watching the others, not standing among them. And then came the testimony. The only known survivor of St. Maron, a woman named Elodie, who had been a teenager in 1954, finally agreed to speak. For decades, she had remained silent, living in obscurity. But when reporters came knocking, she whispered fragments of memory that unsettled even seasoned investigators. It was not sudden, she said. We knew the day was coming. The elders told us we would be taken. They said the water had called, and we must answer. That night, the bells rang, though no one touched the ropes. We followed them. All of us. I ran, I hid in the forest. When I came back, they were gone. The square was empty. Only the sound of the water remained. Her voice faltered when asked what happened next. I tried to forget. But sometimes, even now, I hear the bells. In the distance. And I know they are not finished. Elodie's testimony was controversial. Some dismissed her as senile, her memory warped by trauma. But her account aligned with the priest's letters, with the symbols carved into bread, with the journal found beneath the church. Too many pieces fit. And if she was telling the truth, then St. Maron had not merely vanished, it had been taken. Or perhaps it had gone willingly. But St. Maron was not alone. As researchers dug deeper, they uncovered other disappearances across the region, smaller in scale but eerily similar in detail. A hamlet in the Pyrenees, abandoned overnight in 1892 with meals left uneaten. A fishing village on the Breton coast, where 20 families vanished in 1914, their boats still moored, nets still cast. In each case, there were whispers of strange rituals, of symbols carved in wood and bread, of bells that rang with no hands upon them. Could St. Maron have been the last chapter in a much older story? Or just one thread in a tapestry of silence, stretching across centuries? The more connections surfaced, the darker the picture became. It no longer looked like an isolated tragedy, but like a pattern one hidden in folklore, in church archives, in forgotten journals. A pattern of villages swallowed by silence, erased not by nature, not by war, but by something else. Something that waited, patient, beneath the surface. Something that demanded obedience every few generations. And then the leak. A journalist obtained a classified French government memo from 1965, written during the height of the Cold War. The memo referenced Operation Chanterelle, a surveillance program monitoring rural communities in the Alps for irregular gatherings. It listed St. Maron as a case of interest, along with 3 other villages that had shown signs of non-Catholic rites. The memo's conclusion was stark. Recommend non-interference. Phenomenon appears cyclical. Observation only. If true, this suggested the government had known. They had seen the patterns. And rather than intervene, they had chosen to watch. To let entire communities vanish, so long as the silence stayed contained. At this point, St. Maron was no longer just a mystery of one village. It was a story of complicity, of hidden records, of witnesses silenced by fear. The priest's letters, the photograph, Elodie's testimony, a government memo, all of them pointed to the same truth. St. Maron was part of something bigger, something that had always been there, waiting in the cracks of history. And as the waters of the lake retreated, that truth was rising with them. Asterisk, asterisk, by the winter of 2024, the ruins of St. Maron lay bare, exposed to the cold winds of the Alps. Tourists came to see the ghost village. Journalists came to chase headlines. But those who listened carefully said they heard something else. A sound carried by the empty streets, by the broken church spire. A faint ringing. Like bells, like voices. As if the village itself was not silent at all, but calling out. Waiting. Remembering by early 2025, the mystery of St. Maron was no longer confined to the ruins of a drowned village. It had spread into laboratories, universities, and think tanks across Europe. Scientists, historians, and criminologists all pored over the evidence, searching for a rational explanation. But the more they studied, the more unsettling the story became, not because it could not be explained, but because it could. One of the first breakthroughs came from forensic linguists analyzing the spiral and triangle carvings found on loaves of bread preserved in mineralized layers beneath the bakery. Using high-resolution imaging, researchers confirmed that the marks were deliberate, not decorative. They were arranged in sequences, repeating like a code. Computer analysis compared the symbols to known alphabets and liturgical shorthand. The result, a chilling connection. The spirals matched carvings found on prehistoric stones in Brittany and Ireland, sites long associated with ritual offerings to water. The triangles mirrored symbols recorded in early Christian exorcism texts, used to seal or bind an entity. Together, they formed a language of warning. Not bread for nourishment, but bread as message. As one linguist remarked, they weren't baking to feed. They were baking to speak to something, or to someone. Meanwhile, acoustic engineers studied Elodie's claim that bells rang on the night of the disappearance bells she swore no human hand had touched. They compared her testimony with the faint metallic tones captured on the recovered audio tape. Spectral analysis revealed frequencies inconsistent with any bell of the region. Instead, the sound patterns more closely resembled underwater acoustics, long reverberations shaped by liquid resonance, not air. In other words, the bells might not have rung from the church tower at all, but from beneath the water table itself. The implications were unsettling. Could the villagers have heard bells rising from the depths? And if so, were they responding to something natural or something else entirely? Psychologists, too, weighed in. They compared St. Maron to other documented cases of mass disappearance or cult-like obedience. Jonestown, Heaven's Gate, even ancient rituals recorded in Mesopotamia. The common thread was belief. Entire groups convinced to surrender their will, their lives, in exchange for promised salvation. But St. Maron was different. There was no charismatic leader, no clear doctrine. Instead, there were fragment symbols, songs, whispers, bells, triggers that, when woven together, created an atmosphere strong enough to compel obedience across an entire community. One psychologist put it starkly, "It's not that they followed a man, it's that they followed a sound." In late 2024, forensic teams analyzed bones recovered from the mud near the outskirts of St. Maron's. Scattered fragments, likely washed from graves. DNA testing revealed something unexpected, a genetic cluster among the villagers that set them apart from surrounding populations. Traces of isolated ancestry, possibly dating back centuries, maintained through generations of intermarriage. To some researchers, this explained the village's secrecy and its resistance to outside influence. But to others, it raised a darker possibility that St. Maron had been chosen across time for reasons not just cultural but biological. A community set apart, held apart, for a purpose lost to history. By now, a chilling picture was forming. The villagers had lived apart, worshipped apart, and vanished apart. Their disappearance was not random, it was inherited. The silence of St. Maron was not the first of its kind, nor the last. And modern research suggested that the pattern was not over. Because across Europe, whispers were surfacing of other places, other communities, showing the same signs even now. In Spain, hikers reported stumbling upon a mountain hamlet with doors nailed shut, symbols carved into lintels, and bread with spirals still cooling on window sills, though the villagers themselves were nowhere to be found. In rural Poland, a church was abandoned overnight in 1993, its altar covered in tally marks eerily similar to those found in St. Maron. In southern Italy, fishermen spoke of a coastal town where bells rang beneath the waves every midsummer. Though the church had no bell tower at at first, these accounts were dismissed as folklore. But when journalists cross-referenced them with parish archives and police reports, a pattern emerged: isolated communities, rituals tied to water, sudden vanishings or abandonments, and above all, silence. St. Maron was not alone. It was. One chapter in a book still being written. One case in particular drew chilling parallels. In 1997, a village in eastern Germany was abandoned overnight. Investigators found homes left unlocked, meals unfinished, livestock unfed. On the blackboard of the local school, written in chalk, were the words, "Sie sind gekommen," they have come. The phrase mirrored exactly the message found in St. Maron's schoolhouse. Isle Saint Venus. Two villages, two languages, two eras, the same words, the same silence. Modern researchers struggled to explain such parallels. Were these isolated cases of collective psychosis, triggered by fear and folklore? Or were they echoes, waves in time of the same phenomenon, repeating, demanding obedience every few decades? If so, then the question was not simply what happened in St. Maron, but when and where it would happen again. The darkest suggestion came from a leaked military report, declassified in late 2024, compiled during NATO surveillance exercises. In the Alps, it referenced acoustic anomalies recorded in reservoirs across France, Italy, and Switzerland. The report described low-frequency harmonics rising from the depths, powerful enough to induce disorientation, panic, or trance. In human subjects, though attributed to geological activity, the frequencies bore unsettling resemblance to those captured on the St. Maron audio tape. The report's final line was stark: potential psychological influence, possible weaponization, continue observation. Weaponization. To governments, the silence of St. Maron was not just a mystery. It was a potential tool, a phenomenon to be studied, harnessed. But in their pursuit of science, they ignored the oldest lesson of all. Some things are not meant to be controlled. Some bells once heard cannot be unheard. By the spring of 2025, modern research had unraveled St. Maron's mystery into something far larger. A cycle of vanishings, a chorus of voices rising from water, a pattern repeating across time and place. For scientists, it was a puzzle to be solved. For governments, a phenomenon to be monitored. But for those who stood at the edge of the drained lake, staring into the ruins, it was something simpler and far more terrifying. Proof that St. Maron was never an isolated tragedy. It was a warning. And the warning had come again, because if the bells ring beneath the water, where will they ring next? By midsummer of 2025, the ruins of St. Maron had given up nearly all their secrets. Or so, investigators thought. But as the waters receded to their lowest levels in decades, one final discovery emerged, one that would shatter every theory, every explanation, and leave only dread in its place. In July, workers widening the excavation near the church stumbled upon a fissure in the lakebed. At first, it looked like a collapsed cellar, but as divers descended, they realized it was a tunnel, cut with deliberate precision. The passage sloped downward, far beneath the foundations of the village, until it vanished into absolute blackness. Sonar mapping revealed the tunnel stretched over a mile into the bedrock. Its destination, unknown. Along the walls, carved into stone, were hundreds of spirals, the same symbols found on bread, in journals, on photographs. But here, they were not crude scratches. They were perfect, endless, covering every surface. As if the entire passage was a message, written for something deeper in the earth. Or as if it was a road, guiding the way. Against their better judgment, a small team of divers pushed forward. Hours later, they surfaced pale, shaken, unwilling to speak. What little they revealed was chilling. The tunnel ended in a vast chamber too large to have been carved by human hands alone. In its center stood a stone altar, surrounded by rows of empty niches. But one niche was not empty. Inside lay the preserved remains of a child, no more than 10 years old. In its hands, clasped tightly, was a bell small, bronze, but flawless. When recovered and tested, the bell rang not in air, but underwater, and its tone matched exactly the phantom bells captured on the 1954 audio tape. The implications were staggering. Had the villagers led their children into the tunnel? Had they offered them in exchange for silence? Or had the children led the villagers instead, carrying the bells that summoned something from beneath the earth? No one could answer. But the existence of the chamber proved one thing beyond doubt. St. Marin had not been swallowed by accident. It had been led around the same time. Archivists uncovered missing pages from Father André's journal, hidden between the bindings of another book in Grenoble. The pages were frantic, written in uneven lines. They told me the first was chosen. The bell is not ours. It calls them. The children hear it most clearly. If we refuse, we are drowned. If we obey, we are erased. The final line was scrawled across the page, repeated over and over until the ink tore through the paper. We must go. We must go. We must go. The last and most devastating discovery came during a routine dive to photograph the chamber. The lead diver, a veteran with 30 years' experience, failed to resurface. When his body was recovered, his equipment showed no malfunction, his oxygen untouched, but his face bore an expression of horror frozen into death. On his slate, clutched in his hand, were the words, "They are still here." At this point, the investigation reached its climax. Every artifact, every record, every testimony pointed to the same conclusion. St. Marin had not vanished randomly, nor had it simply collapsed into the lake. It had been part of something larger, a ritual, a pattern, a cycle. The bells were not metaphor, they were literal. The tunnel was not myth, it was real. The voices were not imagination, they had been calling all along. And then, the final twist. When scientists dated the chamber at the end of the tunnel, they discovered it was far older than the village above it. Older than Christianity, older even than Roman settlement. The carvings and the altar predated the foundations of St. Marin by at least 2,000 years, which meant the villagers had not built the chamber. They had found it, and when the bells rang, they did what countless communities before them had done. They answered. The chilling truth was clear. St. Marin had not been unique. It had been chosen, just as others had been chosen across time. And when its moment came, the villagers had walked willingly into the tunnel, guided by bells only they could hear, not vanished, not drowned, led into the dark. Asterisk, asterisk, when news of the chamber broke, the world erupted. Headlines screamed of Europe's Roanoke, the village that walked away, the tunnel of bells. Documentaries aired, theories multiplied. But beneath the noise, one truth remained. The pattern was not over. Because if the chamber was thousands of years old, then the cycle was not finished. It would return. It always had dot as the sun set on. The exposed ruins of St. Marin, tourists gathered along the shores to glimpse the ghost village. But some swore that, as the light faded, they heard it again, the faint toll of a bell, rising from the depths, echoing across the valley. A sound, not carried by wind nor by water, but by memory. A sound that promised the silence of St. Marin was not the end of the story, but the beginning of another. Because if the bells are still ringing, then something is still listening. By the autumn of 2025, the waters of Morning Lake had begun to rise again. Slowly, inevitably, the ruins of St. Maron disappeared beneath the surface, swallowed by silence once more. But what remained, the journals, the photographs, the tunnel, the bell, was enough to change everything. St. Maron was no longer a forgotten village. It was a symbol, a warning carved into stone, ringing through history. We learned that the people of St. Maron did not simply vanish. They prepared. They followed signs older than memory, rituals older than the church itself. They carved symbols into bread. They rang bells that were not meant to be heard. And when the time came, they walked into the darkness willingly, carrying with them their children, their lives, and their silence. We learned that the chamber beneath the lake was not their creation. It was ancient, carved by hands unknown, waiting for generations to rediscover it. Each time the bells rang, another community answered. And each time, the story was buried until it surfaced again, centuries later. St. Maron was not the first, and it will not be the last, but more than anything, we learned that the silence of St. Maron is not finished. The bells that lured the villagers away are still there, still ringing faintly beneath the waters. Divers have recorded the frequencies. Scientists have measured their vibrations. And witnesses, tourists, journalists, locals still swear they've heard the tolling at dusk, echoing across the valley. If the bells are still ringing, then the cycle has not ended. Somewhere, someday soon, another village may answer. Another community may walk into the dark, and the world may once again dismiss it as an accident, a tragedy, a mystery, until the truth surfaces too late. The lesson of St. Maron is simple. Disappearances are not always random. Silence is not always empty. And history, when it repeats, does not repeat gently. It comes like a bell, tolling from the depths, calling us to listen, to remember. 2. Obey. As the last stones of St. Maron slipped beneath the rising water, photographers captured one final image, the church spire, broken but defiant, reflected in the lake. For a moment, the bell tower seemed whole again. For a moment, it was as if the bells were ready to ring once more. Then the waters closed over it, leaving only ripples and silence. Some say the villagers vanished. Others say they were erased. But one truth remains. They never truly left. Because as long as the bells ring beneath the water, St. Maron will never be silent. It waits. It warns. It remembers. And if you ever find yourself by the shores of a quiet lake with no wind in, the air, no church nearby, and yet you hear the faint toll of a bell, don't follow it.